In the quiet corners of history, it is the voices of the forgotten masses that have truly reshaped the world. While kings and generals are remembered, the real power often lies in the hands of those who had nothing but their will to change the course of events. From medieval England to revolutionary France, the common folk, driven by desperation and frustration, have sparked fires of change that have forever altered nations. These uprisings, though often overlooked, are the true stories of human progress. The question remains, why are the voices of the oppressed so often silenced, even though their impact is immeasurable? In the quiet corners of history, beneath the thunderous events that defined empires, there lies a truth often forgotten. It is the unheralded voices, the murmurs of common people, that have quietly reshaped the world in ways most of us never realize. The grand stories we're told of kings, conquerors, and famous generals are often the loudest, most dominant narratives that shape our understanding of the past. Yet, in the shadows, in the hidden spaces between wars and royal decrees, the real shifts in history have often come from the insignificant people, the peasants, the workers, the rebels, and the forgotten ones. Imagine, for a moment, a small village in 14th century England. It's a cool summer evening, and the air is thick with the hum of people living under the harsh rule of a distant monarchy. The people of the village are not on the front lines of any war, nor are they involved in courtly intrigues. They are simple folk, tilling the land, working long hours to survive, with little to no say in the greater forces of power that govern their lives. But as the sun sets, the village is about to be forever changed, not by a battle or a royal edict, but by the whisper of a single voice, a voice that will grow louder and louder, and soon ignite a firestorm of rebellion. This is the voice of a peasant named Wat Tyler, a man whose name would echo in history long after his death, though he was little more than a man of the earth, born in obscurity. He would become one of the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a revolt that threatened to shake the very foundations of the English monarchy. It wasn't Tyler's military prowess or noble lineage that made him a force to be reckoned with. It was his ability to tap into the collective frustrations of the common people, giving them a voice they had never had before. What began as a protest over the rising poll tax soon turned into a full-blown uprising that led thousands of ordinary men and women to march on London. They demanded freedom, justice, and equality, not just for themselves but for future generations. Tyler's death, at the hands of the king's men, marked the end of the revolt, but it was only the beginning of something much greater. The ripples of that rebellion would be felt for centuries to come, influencing everything from labor rights to the very concept of popular sovereignty. But how did this small, seemingly insignificant figure, an unassuming peasant from a small village, manage to create such a seismic shift in history? It wasn't by force alone. It wasn't through violence or bloodshed, though those elements were certainly present. It was through the simple yet profound act of giving voice to the powerless. Tyler, along with his fellow peasants, demonstrated something crucial, that history does not always unfold according to the plans of the powerful, but often in ways that the elites cannot foresee, even when they attempt to control it. The common folk, those whose names do not appear in the annals of kings and queens, have often been the ones to move history in unexpected directions. In another part of the world, far from England, a similar story was unfolding, one that would come to define an entire nation. In France, the seeds of revolution were being sown not in the salons of Parisian aristocrats, but in the streets where the poor, the disenfranchised, and the desperate were beginning to realize that their voices, too, had power. It was the storming of the Bastille in 1789 that ignited the French Revolution, but it was the anger and frustration of common people that provided the fuel. The uprising wasn't driven by the elite intellectuals, though their ideas certainly played a role. It was the rage of the peasants, who were suffering under extreme taxation and poverty, that set the stage for one of the most transformative revolutions in history. The French Revolution was, at its core, a rebellion of the common folk against an unjust system. The revolutionaries were not just fighting for political power, but for the basic right to be heard, to have a say in the shaping of their world. They were fighting for dignity, for equality, for freedom. And in their struggle, they did not just overthrow a king or a system of aristocracy. They reshaped the very idea of what it meant to be a citizen. No longer were power and privilege the exclusive domain of the elite. The voice of the common person had been thrust to the forefront. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity became the rallying cry, forever altering the political landscape not only of France but of the world. But even as these powerful revolutions unfolded, their true significance remained hidden beneath the surface. While historians have often focused on the dramatic moments, the bloodshed, the battles, the iconic leaders, the deeper truth is that these events were only possible because of the collective will of ordinary people. The masses, the ones whose names never appeared in the history books, were the ones who propelled these movements forward. Without the peasants of England rising against the poll tax, without the starving crowds in Paris demanding change, the course of history would have been vastly different. History, in many ways, is a story of invisible forces at work. The voices of the common folk, though often disregarded, have been the true driving forces behind some of the most significant events in human history. These voices are not the loudest, nor the most celebrated, but they are the ones that endure. They are the voices of rebellion, of resistance, of those who dared to challenge the status quo. And though their names may have been lost to time, their legacies remain, woven into the very fabric of the societies we live in today. What's most intriguing about this is the pattern that emerges when we look at the great movements of history. Whether in the fields of England, the streets of Paris, or the factories of the Industrial Revolution, one thing becomes clear. The common folk, despite being oppressed and exploited, have always found ways to reclaim their power. They have never been truly powerless, despite what the elite would have us believe. It is in their silence, their obedience, their suffering, that their true strength lies. It is the collective will of the people, their desire for justice, their yearning for equality, and their hunger for dignity, that has always been the catalyst for change. But the question remains, why have these voices often been overlooked or forgotten? Why are the stories of the common people so frequently erased from the historical record? The answer lies in the very structures of power that dominate our societies. The elite, the powerful, the ruling class, they control the narratives of history. They are the ones who write the books, who build the monuments, who shape the legends. The common folk, the ones who actually drove change, are often relegated to the background, their contributions minimized or ignored. And yet, despite this erasure, their power cannot be fully suppressed. It rises again and again in unexpected places at unexpected times. One of the most striking examples of this phenomenon comes from the story of the suffragette movement. In the early 20th century, women in the United States and the United Kingdom began to demand the right to vote. At the time, they were dismissed as radicals, troublemakers, and even as mentally unstable. Their voices were not heard in the halls of power, and their cause was often mocked. But the suffragettes, many of them common women with no formal education or political connections, managed to change the world. Their courage and persistence, their willingness to face jail time, public scorn, and even physical violence, ultimately led to the granting of voting rights to women, a monumental shift in the structure of society. And yet, how many of these women are remembered today? How many of them have their names etched in history? The suffragette movement, like many others, is often remembered through the lens of the elite figures who helped bring about the change, rather than through the countless ordinary women whose sacrifices made it all possible. The common folk, it seems, have always been both the foundation and the hidden engine of history. We may never know all of their names, but their actions, the quiet, subtle, and sometimes violent acts of resistance, are woven into the very fabric of the world we live in. Without them, the great moments of history would have been nothing but dreams. And perhaps, just perhaps, the voices of the common folk are not as insignificant as we've been led to believe. History is a story we often hear from the mouths of the powerful. The victors, the leaders, the ones who shaped the empires and wrote the laws of the land have been the ones to control the narrative. Their names are immortalized, their faces are etched on monuments, and their deeds are enshrined in textbooks. But, as much as we celebrate these grand tales, there is an undeniable truth hidden in plain sight. History is not simply the story of kings and conquerors. It is, in fact, a much deeper, more complex tale of the people who existed beneath them, often ignored, forgotten, and dismissed as unimportant. The voices of the common folk, the nameless masses, have always shaped the world in ways that most of us fail to recognize. This is a truth that goes unnoticed by most. We are conditioned, from a young age, to believe that history is the product of a few great men and women who left their marks on the world. They are the ones who stand in the spotlight, the ones whose triumphs and tragedies are immortalized in our collective memory. Yet, in reality, those in the background, the laborers, the workers, the peasants, the forgotten men and women who had no titles or fortunes, have often been the ones who set history into motion. While we honor the names of the powerful, we forget the countless others who made those powers possible. Their stories remain buried, lost to time, and this erasure is not accidental. It is a consequence of the very systems that seek to maintain control. In every great revolution, in every moment of societal upheaval, there is a recurring theme. The masses, the unremarkable, the faceless individuals whose lives are seemingly inconsequential to the grand sweep of history, are the ones who drive change. They may not appear in the history books, but their actions, their struggles, their voices reverberate through time. They are the ones who have, time and time again, altered the course of history, though their contributions have often been minimized or outright ignored. The past is riddled with examples of these forgotten figures. Take, for instance, the story of the workers who sparked the Industrial Revolution. While history credits great inventors like James Watt or Henry Ford for revolutionizing the world, it often overlooks the laborers whose sweat and blood laid the foundation for these innovations. In the factories, mines, and mills, it was the working class who powered the engines of progress, though they received little to no recognition for their contributions. It was their long hours, their grueling labor, and their perseverance that made the Industrial Revolution possible. Yet their stories are barely told. They were the backbone of the industrial age, yet their voices were drowned out by the hum of the machines they operated. In the same way, the story of the American Revolution is often told through the lens of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the Founding Fathers, but what about the thousands of ordinary colonists who risked their lives in the fight for independence? What about the farmers, the craftsmen, the mothers, the children, and the enslaved people who played vital roles in the revolution but are rarely given the credit they deserve? While the Founding Fathers are celebrated for their brilliance and leadership, the common soldiers and civilians whose efforts made victory possible are left out of the story. These individuals, many of them illiterate and with little formal education, understood that they were fighting for something far greater than themselves. They fought for freedom, for the right to determine their own fate, and in doing so, they forever altered the course of history. And yet, how often do we hear their names spoken with the same reverence as those of the political elite? This pattern of erasure is not limited to Western history. Around the world, we see countless examples of common people whose actions were pivotal in shaping their societies, but whose names remain largely unknown. In India, for example, the struggle for independence is often remembered through the lens of Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and other prominent leaders. But what about the millions of peasants, laborers, and workers who fought alongside them? The Salt March, one of the most iconic moments in the Indian independence movement, is often associated with Gandhi, but it was the collective participation of the masses that made it successful. The common people of India, many of whom had never been involved in politics before, rose up against the British colonialists in ways that were both small and large. From the women who boycotted British goods to the farmers who refused to pay taxes, it was their collective resistance that ultimately broke the back of the British Empire. Similarly, in Latin America, the struggles for independence were not simply the result of the actions of Simon Bolivar or José de San Martín, but the culmination of decades of resistance by the indigenous and Afro-Latinx populations who had long been oppressed by colonial powers. The wars of independence were fought on the backs of the common people, and yet their contributions are often overshadowed by the names of the generals and leaders who emerged victorious. In the end, it was not just the strategic brilliance of Bolivar that led to the liberation of much of South America, but the tireless efforts of the indigenous farmers, the slaves who fought for their freedom, and the everyday people who joined the fight without fame or glory. This erasure of the common folk from the historical narrative is not a modern phenomenon, either. In the ancient world, too, we see the same pattern. The fall of empires and the rise of new powers were often driven by the struggles of ordinary men and women, though their efforts went largely unrecognized. The Roman Empire, for example, was not brought down by the legions alone. While the Roman military played a critical role in the empire's expansion, it was the pressures from within, the economic exploitation of the lower classes, the growing unrest among slaves, and the uprisings of the plebeians that ultimately led to its collapse. Yet, the history of Rome is often told through the lens of emperors and generals, while the stories of those who lived on the margins are left untold. This phenomenon, the erasure of the commonfolk's contributions to history, can be traced back to the very structures of power that have dominated societies for centuries. The ruling elites, whether they are monarchs, aristocrats, or corporate tycoons, have always sought to maintain control over the narrative. By focusing on their own actions and downplaying the role of the masses, they ensure that their own legacy remains intact while the true sources of power remain hidden. This isn't just a matter of historical oversight. It's a deliberate attempt to maintain the status quo. If the people ever realize the true extent of their power, it could shake the very foundations of society. But while these voices may be overlooked in the official history books, they have never been silenced. Throughout history, the common folk have always found ways to make their voices heard, even if it meant challenging the very systems that sought to suppress them. In fact, it is often in these moments of resistance that the most profound shifts in history occur. Whether it is a workers' strike, a protest for civil rights, or a spontaneous uprising against an unjust ruler, the common people have always shown that they are not powerless. They may not have the same resources or influence as the elite, but they have something far more potent, the collective strength of the many. One of the most enduring lessons from history is that the power of the common folk should never be underestimated. Despite being written out of the official narrative, the actions of the oppressed have always had a profound impact on the world. The voices of the common people may not always be loud, but they are persistent. And when they come together, they are unstoppable. The fight for justice, for equality, and for freedom has always been carried by the hands of the ordinary, and it is in their struggles that we find the true story of human progress. History, then, is not the story of great men and women, but the story of the masses, the ones whose struggles and sacrifices have shaped the world we live in today. They may not be celebrated in the history books, but their contributions are woven into the very fabric of our societies. And as we look to the future, it is the voices of the common folk that will continue to shape the course of history, as they always have. Throughout history, there has always been a quiet undercurrent, a slow-burning fire of discontent among the masses, one that often went unnoticed until it became impossible to ignore. This discontent, rooted in inequality, oppression, and desperation, has sparked countless uprisings, revolutions, and protests, movements that have shaped the course of civilizations, even if they initially seemed insignificant or isolated. The common folk, those whose names are seldom remembered, have often been the true engines of change, rising not out of a desire for fame or glory, but out of sheer necessity. The story of history is not just the story of kings and emperors, but also the story of the everyday people who, when pushed too far, rose up against the forces that sought to control their lives. In every era, from the distant past to the present day, there has been a constant theme. When the voices of the common people are ignored, when their suffering is dismissed as inconsequential, it creates a pressure that eventually builds to a breaking point. And when that point is reached, the results are often dramatic, sweeping, and transformative. It's easy to forget, amid the pomp and circumstance of world leaders and grand political movements, that history has often turned on the smallest of sparks. A whispered conversation in a market square, a labor strike, a petition for better conditions, a simple refusal to accept the status quo. These moments, though they may seem inconsequential at the time, have often ignited revolutions and reshaped the very foundations of society. One of the most powerful illustrations of this phenomenon can be found in the history of peasant uprisings. These uprisings were often sparked by the seemingly minor grievances of the common people. A new tax, a rise in food prices, a drought that made life even harder than it already was. And yet, each of these uprisings, though they may have started with humble origins, carried the potential to unravel entire political systems. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 is a prime example. On the surface, it began as a protest against the imposition of a poll tax, a burden that was felt most acutely by the poorest in society. Yet beneath this seemingly simple grievance lay a far deeper sense of frustration. The peasants were tired of being exploited, tired of being treated as little more than property to be taxed, controlled, and used for the benefit of the nobility and the monarchy. This sense of oppression had been building for years, but it wasn't until the imposition of the tax that the spark was lit. The revolt was led by figures like Wat Tyler, whose name is largely forgotten today, but whose actions shook the foundations of English society. Though the revolt itself was short-lived, the consequences of that uprising rippled throughout history. For the first time, the voices of the common people were heard in a way that could not be ignored. The peasants demanded not only the abolition of the poll tax but also greater freedoms, more rights, and a better quality of life. They were asking for things that seemed impossible at the time, but their courage in standing up against the ruling class left an indelible mark on history. Though the revolt was suppressed, it marked a turning point, a reminder that the power of the people, even the most oppressed among them, should never be underestimated. The power of discontent is not limited to medieval England. Across the globe, we see similar patterns unfolding time and again. In France, on the eve of the French Revolution, the people were also driven by a sense of profound injustice and inequality. For years, the common people of France had suffered under the weight of an oppressive monarchy, a government that taxed them heavily while the aristocracy and clergy were exempt from the same burdens. The king and his court lived in luxury while the masses were forced to endure starvation, poverty, and harsh living conditions. It was this disparity that eventually led to the eruption of the Revolution in 1789. Like the English peasants, the French revolutionaries were not simply fighting for political change. They were fighting for their basic human dignity. The revolution was not the result of a single act of rebellion, but the culmination of years of mounting frustration. It was a rebellion against a system that had ignored the needs of the people for far too long. The storming of the Bastille, one of the most iconic events of the Revolution, is often remembered as the symbolic beginning of the French Revolution. Yet, it was not just the act of storming a prison that marked the moment. It was the act of a people who had finally had enough. The storming of the Bastille was an act of defiance, a refusal to remain silent any longer. It was a moment when the people, who had been oppressed for so long, took control of their destiny. It marked the beginning of a new era in which the voices of the common people would no longer be ignored. The revolution was, in many ways, a direct response to the centuries of inequality, and though it was driven by some of the most famous figures in history, it was the people who made it happen. The power of discontent had been channeled into something far more powerful than anyone could have anticipated. These moments of discontent, though dramatic and often violent, are not the only instances where the common folk have played a pivotal role in reshaping history. Throughout history, we see countless other examples of the masses rising up in seemingly small ways to challenge the systems of power that oppress them. One of the most enduring examples of this is the civil rights movement in the United States. In the mid-20th century, African Americans, long subjected to systemic racism and segregation, began to organize and protest in increasingly bold and effective ways. The movement was born from the daily injustices faced by African Americans, but it was galvanized by specific events, such as the brutal murder of Emmett Till, the Montgomery bus boycott, and the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. These events, though they may have seemed like isolated moments, were the culmination of years of frustration, anger, and a demand for change. The civil rights movement was not simply a struggle for equality in the legal sense. It was a demand for the recognition of basic human dignity. The power of discontent is not always expressed through grand uprisings or revolutions. Sometimes it takes the form of quieter acts of resistance, small, everyday acts that chip away at the foundations of injustice over time. One of the most striking examples of this is the labor movement of the 19th and 20th centuries. Workers in factories, mines, and other industries were often subjected to grueling hours, unsafe working conditions, and meager wages. Yet it was through small acts of rebellion, organizing strikes, forming unions, demanding better conditions, that they were able to force change. These movements, though they began with small groups of workers, eventually led to the establishment of labor rights that improved the lives of millions. These struggles may not have been as dramatic as the revolutions of the past, but they were no less transformative. At the heart of all of these movements lies a simple but powerful truth. The voice of the common people, when unified, cannot be ignored. The power of discontent, once it reaches a critical mass, has the ability to challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. The common folk, though they may be dismissed as insignificant or powerless by those in control, have always had the power to change the world. What begins as a whisper of dissatisfaction can grow into a roar that shakes the very foundations of society. These moments of discontent are not just important because they challenge authority, but because they reveal the underlying truth that society's power structures are not as unshakable as they may seem. The role of the common folk in shaping history is often overlooked, but it is their struggles, their sacrifices, and their demands for justice that have laid the groundwork for much of the progress we take for granted today. Whether it is the peasants of medieval Europe, the revolutionaries of France, or the workers of the Industrial Revolution, history has been shaped by the voices of those who have been silenced by the powerful. It is in these moments of discontent that we see the true power of the people, the power to change the world, even when they are told they are powerless. What the history books often fail to recognize is that the struggle of the common folk is not simply about achieving political power. It is about achieving something far deeper, the recognition of their humanity, their dignity, and their right to shape their own destinies. The revolutions, protests, and movements that have altered the course of history were not just about overthrowing regimes. They were about creating a world where ordinary people could stand up, speak out, and demand their place at the table. And in that struggle, they have left an indelible mark on the world, one that cannot be erased. Their power, once unleashed, cannot be put back in the bottle. The common folk's discontent is not just the story of history. It is the heartbeat of history, pulsing through every significant change, every revolution, and every moment of transformation. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 stands as one of the most significant and dramatic moments in the history of medieval England. It began as a protest against an oppressive and increasingly harsh tax system, but its impact would echo for centuries. The revolt was not simply a series of spontaneous uprisings led by angry peasants. It was a manifestation of long-simmering resentment toward an elite class that had long exploited the labor and lives of the common people. It was a rebellion that would forever alter the power dynamics of the country, shifting the way power was perceived, not only by the ruling classes but by the peasants themselves. What started as a few disgruntled voices would soon swell into a powerful movement that would shake the very foundations of the English social order. The immediate trigger for the revolt was the imposition of the poll tax, a flat tax levied on every adult in the kingdom, regardless of their wealth. In the aftermath of the Black Death, which had decimated the population of Europe and England alike, the government, desperate for funds to finance its wars and maintain its operations, imposed this heavy and unjust tax. The people who had already suffered immense losses were now being asked to shoulder a financial burden that they simply could not bear. The poll tax, which required a fixed amount from every adult, including the poorest of the poor, seemed the last straw for the already beleaguered peasantry. It was an imposition that did not take into account the social and economic realities of the time. For the common folk, many of whom were struggling to survive, the poll tax was a direct assault on their already tenuous existence. The peasants who lived in rural villages were not the only ones affected. The towns and cities, too, were filled with people who had been crushed under the weight of economic hardship and the aftermath of the plague. Yet, it was in the rural areas that the revolt first took shape. Peasants in Kent and Essex, two regions with large populations of landless laborers, began to organize protests and refusals to pay the tax. These protests began as small, localized actions. But the anger that had been brewing for years among the common folk, stirred by the harshness of their lives and the arrogance of their rulers, soon found its rallying cry in the poll tax. These initial protests were not coordinated. They were spontaneous eruptions of frustration. However, as news of the revolt spread from village to village, it began to take on a more organized and determined character. One of the most important figures in the peasants' revolt was Wat Tyler, a leader whose name would become synonymous with the uprising. Tyler was a man of humble origins, a peasant who, like so many others, had suffered under the oppressive policies of the government. His story is one of transformation, from a mere laborer to the charismatic leader of a massive rebellion. While his exact background is shrouded in mystery, it is clear that Tyler was a man of conviction and vision. He had the ability to unite the diverse and fragmented groups of peasants, and, for a time, he became the figurehead of the revolt. The peasants, who had been told for generations that they were nothing more than pawns in a game controlled by the nobility and the monarchy, found in Tyler a leader who was able to articulate their frustrations and channel their anger into a focused movement. The revolt gathered steam as it spread across the country. By the time it reached London, the peasants were no longer simply protesting a tax. They were demanding nothing less than the abolition of the feudal system itself. They called for the end of serfdom, the removal of oppressive landlords, and the establishment of a more egalitarian society. The revolt had grown into something far larger than just a fight over a tax. It had become a fight for basic human dignity and justice. The peasants wanted to be recognized as more than just instruments of labor. They wanted to be seen as human beings with rights and aspirations. They wanted to be able to work the land without fear of exploitation, to have a say in how they were governed, and to be treated with respect. The fact that such demands could be made so boldly was a testament to the determination and courage of the peasants who had, until then, been forced to live in the shadows of history. The revolt reached its climax in the summer of 1381, when the peasants, led by Tyler, marched on London. The city, which had been home to the elite, the nobility, and the monarchy, was seen as the symbol of the power and privilege that the peasants sought to overthrow. The march on London was a statement, not just of anger but of hope, a hope that the long-standing inequality of the social order could be dismantled, that the common people could take control of their own futures. The peasants breached the walls of the city and, in an act of symbolic defiance, attacked the homes of the wealthy, burned records of debts and rents, and demanded that the king meet with their representatives. The king at the time, Richard II, was a young and inexperienced monarch who had only recently come to the throne. The peasants saw him as a figurehead, someone who was controlled by the aristocracy and incapable of addressing their grievances. However, when the peasants reached London, they were granted an audience with Richard II. In a meeting that would go down in history, Wat Tyler and his fellow leaders of the revolt presented their demands to the king. They called for the abolition of serfdom, the removal of taxes, and the right to freely move about the country. They also demanded that the king reform the legal system, which they believed was rigged in favor of the nobility. It was a remarkable moment, one in which the common people were able to confront the king himself and demand that their voices be heard. But the meeting would not last long. Tyler, who had been the face of the rebellion, was soon killed in a confrontation with the king's soldiers. Whether he was assassinated by the king's men or killed in an unfortunate altercation, his death marked the end of the revolt's most successful phase. With Tyler's death, the peasants lost their central figurehead and were unable to maintain the momentum of the uprising. The rebellion fizzled out, and the leadership of the revolt was scattered. However, the damage had already been done. The peasants' revolt had shown the English elite that the common people were not powerless. For the first time, the peasants had shown that they could organize, they could resist, and they could stand up to the very systems that had kept them in poverty for centuries. Though the revolt itself was crushed and many of its leaders were executed, its impact was far-reaching. The social order in England was never quite the same again. The revolt forced the monarchy to rethink its approach to governance, and while it did not lead to an immediate revolution, it laid the groundwork for future reforms. The peasants' revolt demonstrated that the common folk were not passive subjects. They were active participants in the shaping of their world, and their demands could no longer be ignored. In the aftermath of the revolt, many of the demands of the peasants were rejected by the ruling classes. The status quo was restored, and many of the rebels were executed. But the memory of the revolt lingered in the collective consciousness of the people. It inspired future generations to continue the fight for social justice, for equality, and for the recognition of the inherent dignity of all human beings, regardless of their social class. The peasants' revolt was not just a revolt against an unjust tax. It was a rebellion against the entire system that had kept the poor in servitude for generations. It was a demand for recognition, for dignity, for the simple right to live without fear of oppression. The story of the revolt is a story of courage and defiance, of ordinary people coming together to challenge the powerful forces that sought to keep them down. Though the revolt was ultimately defeated, its legacy lives on, reminding us that even the most powerless among us have the ability to change the course of history. The way history is often remembered and told, it's easy to assume that it's the great leaders, the monarchs, and the elite who shape the course of events. But in reality, history has been driven forward by far more than just these towering figures. Beneath the surface of these grand events, there's an untold story, the story of the common people, the ones whose names we don't remember and whose contributions are often left out of the history books. The people who, when given the chance to rise, have shaken the foundations of the world around them. These moments of rebellion, of protest, and of revolution often don't come from a place of power, but from a place of desperation, frustration, and a deep need for justice. Throughout history, the common folk have often been the ones who have made history happen. These are the forgotten heroes who are rarely remembered by name, but whose actions have had a profound impact on shaping the world we know today. When they rise up, when they speak out, when they demand change, they can alter the course of nations, cultures, and entire societies. And yet, these revolutions, uprisings, and movements are often dismissed as insignificant by the ruling powers that be, who would prefer to focus on their own triumphs and legacies. What they fail to realize, however, is that the true force of history is driven by the collective will of the people, the masses who, despite being marginalized and oppressed, possess an immense power to change the world. One of the most striking examples of this is the American Revolution, a conflict often seen as a story of lofty ideals and philosophical arguments. The image of George Washington crossing the Delaware River, Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, and Benjamin Franklin negotiating with foreign powers has long dominated the narrative. But what is often overlooked is the role of the common people in bringing about this revolution. The American colonists who fought for independence weren't just those at the top of society. They were farmers, tradesmen, artisans, and laborers, people who had long been treated as subjects rather than citizens. When they took up arms against the British Empire, they were not just fighting for political freedom. They were fighting for something far more personal, the right to live without oppression, to have a say in their own futures, and to be treated as equals. The American Revolution was a revolution of the people, even though many of the historical records focus on the Founding Fathers. It was the farmers and workers who fought in the Continental Army, many of whom had never seen a battle before and had no real training in warfare. They were ordinary people who were thrust into an extraordinary conflict, and their courage and resilience were the driving forces behind the revolution's success. The story of the revolution is not just the story of the political leaders. It is the story of the soldiers who fought in the trenches, the women who supported the cause from the home front, and the enslaved people who saw an opportunity to fight for their freedom. These individuals, whose names are often lost to history, were the backbone of the revolution. Their sacrifices were just as important as the decisions made by the political elite, and without their contributions, the revolution would never have succeeded. The American Revolution wasn't the only movement driven by the common people. The French Revolution of 1789, for example, was another moment in history that was largely shaped by the anger, frustration, and desperation of the lower classes. While much of the attention is given to figures like Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Napoleon Bonaparte, it is easy to forget that the revolution was primarily fueled by the actions of ordinary Parisians, workers, peasants, and artisans who had been suffering under an oppressive and corrupt monarchy for years. The French monarchy had lived lavishly while the people starved. The nobility and clergy were exempt from taxes while the common people bore the brunt of economic hardship. After years of being ignored and exploited, the people of Paris decided they had had enough. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, became a symbol of their rebellion against the system that had oppressed them for so long. The peasants and urban workers who participated in the French Revolution were not political philosophers or military generals. They were not people who had any formal training in governance. But they were the ones who carried the revolution forward. They took to the streets, demanded change, and fought for a new social order. The revolution wasn't just about overthrowing a monarchy. It was about changing the very structure of French society. The revolutionaries wanted a society based on equality, liberty, and fraternity, ideals that had been long out of reach for the common people. Through their efforts, they managed to overthrow the old order and create a new political system. The French Revolution did not just change France. It changed the world, setting the stage for future revolutions and movements for equality and justice around the globe. And while the names of the great leaders are remembered, the names of the ordinary men and women who made the revolution possible often go unspoken. Their sacrifices and efforts are just as important, just as monumental, as the deeds of their more famous counterparts. Across the world, we see similar patterns. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, led by figures like Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, is often remembered as the triumph of the working class. But the success of the revolution was not just due to the actions of these leaders. It was the result of decades of unrest and frustration among the Russian people, particularly the peasants and workers who had long been exploited by the Tsarist regime. The industrial workers of St. Petersburg, the soldiers on the front lines of World War I, and the peasants in the countryside were the ones who truly powered the revolution. They were the ones who provided the muscle and the momentum that made it possible to overthrow the Tsar and establish a new socialist order. The Bolsheviks may have provided the ideology and the leadership, but it was the common people who provided the strength to make it happen. Even in more modern times, the role of the common people in shaping history cannot be underestimated. The civil rights movement in the United States, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, was a direct response to the systemic oppression of African Americans. While these leaders are rightly remembered for their contributions, it is important to remember that they were not acting alone. The civil rights movement was powered by the efforts of countless ordinary people who stood up, marched, and fought for their rights. It was the people who organized sit-ins, led protests, and endured brutal violence at the hands of segregationists. These individuals, many of whom were not famous, were the true driving force behind the movement. They risked their lives and their safety to demand justice, and their efforts helped to bring about significant legal and social changes that continue to resonate today. What these examples show is that history is not just the story of those who hold power, but of those who rise up against it. The common people, the workers, the peasants, the disenfranchised, have always been the ones who carry the weight of history. They may not always be the ones who are remembered in the grand narrative, but without their struggles and sacrifices, the world would look vastly different. When these people rise up, they don't just change the course of events, they redefine what is possible. They challenge the very systems that have kept them in their place and, in doing so, reshape the future for everyone. The common people, when they rise in unison, have the power to overturn governments, dismantle entire political systems, and bring about profound social change. History has been shaped, not by the decisions of kings and generals alone, but by the actions of ordinary people who dared to believe that they could change their world. The revolutionaries may be the ones whose names are remembered, but it is the common people whose voices have always driven history forward. And as we look to the future, it is clear that the power of the people, the power of the common folk, remains just as potent as it ever was. Their voices may be quiet, but when they come together, they are impossible to ignore. They are the true force that shapes history, and their stories are the stories of the world itself. Throughout history, there are certain moments when the invisible forces of oppression collide with the unyielding spirit of the masses, and a quiet revolution begins. These revolutions are not always loud, not always dramatic, and often not immediately successful in the ways we would expect. Yet, they are the very essence of human change, driven by the most fundamental human needs: dignity, justice, and the right to live free from the shackles of exploitation. When the common folk rise, it is not always to challenge a single ruler or to seek immediate glory. More often than not, their actions are a cry for basic survival, for a life where they are no longer treated as mere instruments for the advancement of the powerful. What these revolutions reveal, however, is the astonishing resilience of the human spirit, a spirit that refuses to be crushed, even when faced with overwhelming odds. The revolutions that arise from the common folk are often born in the darkest corners of society, in places where the light of privilege rarely reaches. It is easy to forget the kind of daily suffering endured by the poor, the laborers, and the marginalized until something forces them to fight back. These movements, no matter how small they may seem in the moment, have always carried the potential to ignite larger shifts in the way society functions. And while many of these revolutions may not be celebrated in history books, they are, in many ways, the unseen forces that shape the world in which we live. It is easy to look at the great political upheavals of the past, the revolutions that changed nations, and attribute their success to political ideologies, military leaders, or strategic brilliance. However, the truth is that these revolutions would never have occurred without the collective action of the common people. Consider, for example, the Industrial Revolution, one of the most transformative periods in human history. While history tends to focus on the innovations of inventors like James Watt or Henry Ford, or on the vast wealth generated by industrial magnates, the true heart of the Industrial Revolution lies in the stories of the workers who powered it. These were the men, women, and children who worked in the factories, mines, and mills, often under deplorable conditions, to produce the goods that fueled this new era of industry. Their labor was the force that turned the wheels of progress, even as they themselves were left to suffer in silence. And yet, despite the grueling work, the long hours, and the oppressive conditions, it was this very labor that enabled the Industrial Revolution to happen. The vast majority of the population, the ones who were toiling away in factories and mines, had no voice in the decision-making processes that shaped their lives. They were treated as disposable, replaceable cogs in the great machine of industry. And yet, in time, their voices began to be heard. The workers' struggles, the strikes, and the protests they organized were not just about better wages or working conditions, they were about human dignity. They were demanding the right to live with some measure of respect, to be seen as more than just tools for economic growth. In this way, the labor movement was an expression of the common folk's need to be treated as human beings. These early struggles laid the groundwork for labor rights, for the recognition of the fact that the workers who had made the Industrial Revolution possible were entitled to some share of its benefits. Though it took time for the changes to materialize, the collective power of the workers slowly but surely forced the government and the business elite to acknowledge their demands. And then there is the story of the women's suffrage movement, which, like the labor movement, was rooted in a demand for equality and respect. Women, who had long been relegated to the margins of society, fought tirelessly for the right to vote, for the right to be heard in the political sphere. They, too, were part of a long tradition of rebellion against the systems that sought to silence them. The suffragettes did not simply want a piece of the power pie. They wanted to reshape the way power itself was structured. In many ways, the suffrage movement was not just about political rights, but about social transformation. It was about challenging the very notions of gender, class, and power that had long kept women in subservient roles. Women had long been told that their voices didn't matter, that they had no place in the public or political realms. Yet, these women, suffragists and suffragettes, rose up in defiance. They staged protests, went on hunger strikes, and endured imprisonment in their fight for the right to vote. They were often met with ridicule, disdain, and violence, but they persisted, and in the end, they succeeded. It is easy to see these movements as isolated events, as singular struggles fought by specific groups for specific rights. But the truth is that they were all part of a larger, interconnected struggle for equality, justice, and freedom. Whether it was the workers fighting for their dignity in the factories, the women fighting for the right to vote, or the oppressed challenging the social and political systems that kept them marginalized, they were all fighting for the same thing: the right to be heard, the right to live with dignity, and the right to shape the world in which they lived. One of the most poignant aspects of these movements is that, at their core, they were not about overthrowing one system in favor of another. They were about changing the very foundations of society. The workers did not simply want to replace one set of elites with another. They wanted to create a system that acknowledged their humanity. The women who fought for suffrage did not simply want to vote in the same system that had oppressed them for so long. They wanted to change the way that system functioned. In both cases, these movements were about creating a more just, equitable world. And in both cases, they succeeded in ways that were not immediately apparent, but that would ultimately change the course of history. The power of the common folk has often been underestimated. But when they rise up, when they demand justice, they have the ability to change the very fabric of society. It is not always a quick or easy process, but the power of the people is undeniable. And though the struggles of the common folk may be overlooked in history books, their impact can be seen in the fundamental changes that occur in the wake of their actions. Whether it is the labor rights that were won in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, the suffrage that women gained through decades of struggle, or the civil rights that were earned through the tireless efforts of activists in the 20th century, these victories were not the result of political elites or powerful leaders. They were the result of ordinary people. People who had had enough, people who refused to remain silent, people who were determined to be seen and heard. These movements reveal something essential about the nature of power. It is not always wielded from the top down. It is often created from the ground up. The history of social change is not just the history of great leaders, but the history of ordinary people who, when pushed to the brink, rise up and demand what is rightfully theirs. The real power, it turns out, has always resided with the people. When they come together, when they stand united, when they find the courage to rise against the systems that seek to keep them down, they become an unstoppable force. And while the world may not always acknowledge them in the moment, the changes they create are often the ones that have the most lasting impact. As we look back at these movements, we are reminded of the power of the common folk, of the ability of ordinary people to change the course of history. It is not always the wealthy, the powerful, or the famous who shape the world. It is the ones whose names are forgotten, whose struggles are overlooked, who, in the end, create the world we live in today. They may not always be celebrated in the annals of history, but their contributions are what make history happen. The common folk have always had the power to reshape the world, and their struggles, their courage, and their resilience continue to resonate in the changes we see around us today. The nature of societal change is often unpredictable, and it is deeply embedded in the quiet defiance of the oppressed. Across every culture, era, and revolution, the common folk have played a pivotal role in shaping the course of history, often without receiving the credit they so richly deserve. Their struggles have been the driving force behind social, political, and economic transformations, not merely in response to immediate injustices, but also in the fight for dignity, equality, and recognition. Though often disregarded by the powerful and relegated to the margins of historical narratives, the stories of those who have resisted are among the most enduring and impactful of all. These moments of revolt, however small they may seem at the time, form the bedrock of the world as we know it today. They serve as potent reminders that when those in power refuse to listen to the cries of the common people, the people themselves will find ways to make their voices heard. One of the most telling features of these uprisings is that they are often not born from a single event or grievance. Instead, they emerge from a collection of small, everyday indignities, injustices, and hardships that, over time, build up a simmering tension. The boiling point is not always predictable, and the spark that ignites the fire can be something as seemingly insignificant as a single unjust law, an oppressive tax, or an act of public humiliation. It is the cumulative effect of these smaller instances of inequality that transforms into something much larger. The story of the American Civil War, for example, is often framed as a conflict over slavery, but it is also a story of the deep and pervasive inequality that existed between the North and the South, between those who held power and those who were denied basic rights. The war didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of centuries of simmering tensions, economic exploitation, and racial injustice. The common folk who fought in that war, both black and white, were not simply defending a political system or fighting for an abstract ideal. They were fighting for their lives, their families, and their communities. The same can be said of the English Civil War, which, like its American counterpart, was rooted in the struggles of the common people against a ruling elite that saw them as mere pawns. The English Civil War was not simply a conflict between monarchists and parliamentarians. It was a deep, existential struggle over the relationship between the ruling class and the common folk. The struggle for political representation, the right to live without fear of persecution, and the demand for economic fairness were at the heart of the conflict. The poor, the farmers, and the laborers who fought in this war were not necessarily motivated by a desire to change the world. They were motivated by the necessity of survival, the need to live with a modicum of dignity and to break free from the chains of centuries of oppressive rule. They fought because they saw the war as a way to secure their own futures, even if they were not fully aware of the broader implications of their struggle. In many ways, these revolutions are not just about political power. They are about the fight for humanity itself. The oppressed, whether they are workers, slaves, peasants, or women, are not simply demanding a shift in who holds the reins of power. They are demanding recognition of their intrinsic worth as human beings. The rise of the abolitionist movement, which sought to end the institution of slavery, is another striking example of this. Slavery was not just an economic system. It was a moral and spiritual blight on society. The common people who fought for the abolition of slavery were not merely fighting to end a system of forced labor. They were fighting to assert the inherent humanity of millions of people who had been treated as property. The abolitionists were ordinary men and women who, despite facing overwhelming odds, stood up for what they knew was right. The power of the abolitionist movement lay not in the wealth or political power of its leaders, but in the moral clarity of its cause. The common folk who joined the movement, both black and white, were the ones who carried the banner of freedom forward. They were the ones who marched, who wrote, who spoke out against the injustice they saw, and who ultimately brought about one of the most profound shifts in the history of the world. But it is not only the oppressed who rise up against injustice. Sometimes, the common folk rise up in defense of their own dignity in the face of profound loss and violence. Take, for instance, the story of the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, during which the Polish resistance fought against Nazi occupation in World War II. The people of Warsaw had already suffered years of brutal oppression, as the Nazis had executed and imprisoned countless citizens, destroyed entire neighborhoods, and deported thousands to labor camps and death camps. But despite this unimaginable suffering, the common people of Warsaw, many of whom were part of the underground resistance, took a stand against the Nazis. Their uprising was not a fight for political power or military superiority, but a fight to preserve their humanity. They fought not just to survive but to remind the world that even in the face of genocide, the human spirit could not be broken. The Warsaw Uprising was ultimately unsuccessful in its immediate goals, as the Nazi forces crushed the resistance and devastated the city. Yet, the courage of the common people in this moment, their defiance, their unwillingness to be silenced even in the face of certain defeat, became a powerful symbol of resistance against tyranny. It was a reminder that, in the darkest of times, the spark of human dignity can still burn bright. This notion of rising up in the defense of humanity is one of the most powerful aspects of the common folk's revolutions. While political systems and economic structures may come and go, the fight for human dignity transcends the boundaries of time and place. The French Revolution, for instance, was driven by the same forces that motivated the American Revolution and the English Civil War, a desire to overthrow a corrupt system that had oppressed the common people for too long. The peasants and working-class citizens of France, having endured years of high taxes, famine, and inequity, were no longer willing to accept the status quo. What started as a small protest against an unjust tax quickly grew into a nationwide movement for justice, equality, and fraternity. The storming of the Bastille, the violent clashes between the people and the aristocracy, and the eventual rise of the Republic were all part of this larger struggle for recognition. It wasn't simply about changing the political system. It was about ensuring that the people, the workers, the farmers, the common folk, had a voice in the creation of a new society. In many ways, the French Revolution was not only a battle for the future of France but for the future of the common people everywhere. Yet, even as these revolutions spread across nations and continents, the common folk struggles were not always met with immediate success or recognition. Often, they were quashed by the forces of reaction, by those who had the power to silence dissent. The struggle for equality, for justice, for basic human dignity is one that has been ongoing for centuries, and it continues in various forms today. Whether it is the fight for labor rights, for racial justice, for gender equality, or for environmental justice, the common folk remain at the forefront of this ongoing battle. But the question remains, why do the oppressed continue to rise, despite the constant weight of history pressing down upon them? The answer, perhaps, lies in the undeniable truth that the spirit of resistance is a fundamental part of what it means to be human. The common folk fight not only for material gain or political power, but for something much more profound, their right to exist with dignity, their right to define their own lives, and their right to resist the forces that would reduce them to mere objects of exploitation. History may remember the kings, the generals, the politicians, and the celebrities who shaped the events of the past, but it is the common folk who have always provided the true heart of these changes. It is their courage, their sacrifices, and their unwavering belief in their own humanity that have driven the course of history. Their struggles, while often ignored or minimized in the grand narratives of history, are what have created the world we live in today. Each revolt, each protest, each act of defiance has left an indelible mark on society, forcing the powerful to reckon with the reality that the common folk are not passive victims but active agents in the shaping of their own destinies. This truth is timeless, and it will continue to resonate as long as there are those who dare to challenge the forces that seek to control and subjugate them. Revolutions, uprisings, and societal movements are not just shaped by the loud voices of politicians, generals, or scholars. They are often propelled by the quiet but insistent will of those whose names may never be written in history books, yet whose actions resonate through the ages. The common folk, those whose labor sustains society yet who remain largely invisible in the eyes of the powerful, have historically been the driving force behind the most profound changes in human civilization. While many may view history as a chronicle of monarchs, emperors, and emperors, the reality is far more complex. It is the ordinary men and women, the farmers, the workers, the artisans, and the oppressed, who, when pushed to the edge, have often sparked revolutions that would reshape the course of history. Their struggles for dignity, justice, and human rights have challenged entrenched systems of power, and though they may not have always succeeded in their immediate goals, their actions have planted the seeds for future change. The resistance of the common folk has often been born out of necessity driven by the weight of injustice and inequality. The struggle for a better life is not always fought on grand stages or through violent uprisings. Sometimes, it begins quietly, with small acts of defiance, with whispers of rebellion that grow louder over time. Take, for instance, the labor movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. They began not with the power of kings or the influence of intellectuals, but with the raw, unfiltered anger of workers who were being exploited, dehumanized, and denied the basic right to earn a fair living. These movements were born in the factory floors, in the mines, and in the sweatshops, where the common folk worked tirelessly for meager wages, under unsafe and brutal conditions. They were the lifeblood of industrial economies, yet they were treated as expendable. The Industrial Revolution itself, while often hailed as a period of progress and innovation, was also a time of immense suffering for the working class. The machines that powered factories were not only symbols of progress. They were instruments of dehumanization. The factory workers, often children, were subjected to long hours of backbreaking labor in hazardous conditions, with little to no compensation for their suffering. They were treated as mere cogs in a machine, their humanity stripped away in favor of efficiency and profit. The horrors of child labor, the grinding poverty, and the lack of any meaningful protection for workers ignited a fire of resistance that would blaze through the world for decades to come. The rise of labor unions, the strikes, the protests, and the demands for workers' rights were not the products of some far-reaching political conspiracy. They were the result of the common folk coming together, united in their shared experience of injustice. They fought not just for better wages or safer working conditions, but for their fundamental right to live with dignity, to be treated as more than mere commodities to be bought and sold. The success of these early labor movements did not come easily, nor did it come quickly. It took years of struggle, sacrifice, and, at times, violence. The working class was met with fierce resistance from the ruling elite, who sought to preserve the status quo and maintain their power. The first laws that sought to protect workers were hard-won and frequently disregarded. Yet, in the face of overwhelming adversity, the common folk persisted. They understood that their fight was not just about securing immediate improvements in their lives, but about ensuring that future generations of workers would not have to endure the same hardships they had faced. Their struggle laid the foundation for the labor rights we take for granted today: the right to a fair wage, the right to organize, the right to work in safe conditions. The fruits of their labor were not immediately apparent, but over time, their efforts brought about the social and political changes that would transform societies across the globe. Similarly, The history of women's rights is a story of perseverance and quiet defiance. For centuries, women were denied basic rights to property, education, and, most importantly, the right to be heard. They were confined to the private sphere, relegated to domestic duties while the men in their lives enjoyed the freedoms and privileges of public life. It was a system that saw women not as equal participants in society but as subordinates, their voices silenced and their lives controlled by patriarchal norms. Yet, even within this stifling system, women began to resist. Early feminist movements, led by women like Mary Wollstonecraft, Harriet Tubman, and Susan B. Anthony, were born out of this very injustice. These women fought not only for the right to vote but for the right to be recognized as full human beings, deserving of the same rights and freedoms as men. The suffrage movements, both in the United States and in Europe, were not without their struggles. Women who dared to speak out, to demand their rights, were met with derision, violence, and institutionalized opposition. The battles for the vote were not fought by elites or intellectuals. They were fought by ordinary women, housewives, teachers, workers, mothers, who had endured the weight of gendered oppression for centuries. They understood that their struggle was not just about securing a political right. It was about altering the very fabric of society. The suffragettes, for example, did not merely want to participate in a system that oppressed them. They wanted to change that system entirely, to make it more inclusive, just, and equitable. Their fight for the vote was about the fight for human dignity and autonomy. They were not asking for special treatment but for the basic recognition of their worth as human beings. The legacy of these movements is not just found in the victories they secured but in the profound shift in societal attitudes that they helped foster. The achievements of the labor and women's rights movements were not just about winning legal battles or gaining political representation. They were about redefining what it meant to be human. They challenged the status quo, broke down the walls of inequality, and forced society to acknowledge the humanity of those who had been previously ignored or oppressed. These movements did not just change the lives of the individuals who participated in them, they changed the lives of every person who followed. They reshaped our understanding of justice, equality, and human dignity, and they laid the groundwork for future struggles for civil rights and social justice. The struggles of the common folk, however, were not always fought in the arenas of labor unions or political movements. Sometimes they were fought in the streets, in the homes, and in the hearts of individuals who refused to accept the status quo. The civil rights movement in the United States, for example, was not a movement driven solely by intellectuals or political elites. It was driven by the ordinary people, black men and women, who had suffered under the yoke of slavery, segregation, and racial injustice for centuries. While figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks are often credited with leading the movement, it was the countless others, many of whom remain nameless, who were the true lifeblood of the struggle. The protests, the sit-ins, the marches, the boycotts, these were the actions of people who had been pushed to the brink, people who were determined to no longer accept a system that dehumanized them. They fought not just for the end of segregation, but for the recognition of their basic humanity. In doing so, they forced a nation to confront the moral failure of its treatment of its black citizens. The importance of the common folk's involvement in these movements cannot be overstated. The civil rights activists were not fighting for power or privilege. They were fighting for justice and the right to live as equals. The common people who marched with King, who boycotted buses, who fought for the right to vote, were not doing so for their own gain. They were doing so for the future generations who would inherit a better, more just society. They were driven by a collective sense of righteousness and moral duty, and through their actions, they transformed the political and social landscape of America. The story of the common folk's role in history is not one of fleeting victories or shallow struggles. It is a story of endurance, of quiet courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It is the story of people who, when faced with injustice, refused to be passive. They resisted not because they sought power but because they sought justice. They fought not for themselves, but for the future, for the dignity of those who would follow them. The common folk, though they may be forgotten in the grand narratives of history, are the true architects of social change. Their actions may seem small in the moment, but their collective power has reshaped the world in ways that we continue to feel today. The collective power of the common folk has been the driving force behind some of the most pivotal moments in history, though their contributions often remain hidden beneath the more prominent figures that history chooses to remember. What often goes unnoticed in these grand narratives of revolution and change is the sheer determination and resilience of those at the bottom of the social ladder, those who had no political power, no wealth, and no formal training but who, nonetheless, changed the course of history through their actions. These individuals, bound by their shared struggles, have risen up in defiance against the systems that sought to oppress them. When they did, they set in motion changes that were often as transformative as they were unpredictable. The rise of these movements is often seen through the lens of political upheaval, bloody revolutions, the overthrow of regimes, or the collapse of empires. But when we look closer, we see that the true power of these movements lies not in their external manifestations but in the deeper, quieter forces that drove them. A desire for dignity, a yearning for justice, and a refusal to accept the status quo. The common folk, despite their lack of resources or formal education, have always carried the fire of change within them. They are the ones who, when pushed to the edge, have the power to rise and, in doing so, challenge the very foundations of power. Take, for example, the history of the Haitian Revolution, one of the most remarkable yet often overlooked revolutions in history. The Haitian Revolution stands as a testament to the power of the enslaved, those who, for centuries, had been treated as property, as nothing more than tools to fuel the wealth of European colonial powers. In 1791, the enslaved people of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, rose up in a rebellion that would go on to shape the future of not just the Caribbean but of the world. The Haitian slaves were not fighting for political power or for personal gain. They were fighting for their basic human rights, the right to be free, to be seen as human beings, and to live a life of dignity. Their uprising, fueled by centuries of suffering, sparked a revolution that would overthrow the French colonial system and lead to the establishment of the first independent Black republic in the world. What makes the Haitian Revolution so significant is not just the success of the revolt but the fact that it was carried out by those who had been deemed insignificant by the colonial powers. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue were not supposed to have the power to rise up, to challenge the established order. They were supposed to be invisible, their suffering tolerated in the name of profit. But when these men and women rose in defiance, they shattered the myth of their inferiority and showed the world that the power of the common folk, even those without the trappings of wealth or status, was far greater than anyone had imagined. The revolution in Saint-Domingue was not a neat, well-coordinated affair, but a brutal and violent uprising that reflected the immense human cost of the system of slavery. The resistance was fueled by a collective rage against an institution that had dehumanized them for so long, and it resulted in the creation of a new political order that recognized the dignity and humanity of those who had been enslaved. The Haitian Revolution, though often left out of mainstream historical accounts, was one of the most significant events of the 18th century, fundamentally altering the course of both the Atlantic world and the history of colonialism. In Europe, too, the common folk played an instrumental role in the shaping of history, particularly during the period of the French Revolution. The French Revolution, much like the Haitian Revolution, was driven not by the aristocracy or the elite but by the struggles of the poor, the working class, and the disenfranchised. In the years leading up to the revolution, France was in the grip of a financial crisis. The monarchy, led by Louis XVI, was deeply in debt, and the common people were burdened by high taxes, famine, and rising prices. The anger among the peasants, workers, and urban poor was palpable, and when the Estates General convened in 1789, it became clear that the old social and political order was on the brink of collapse. What followed was a series of events that would forever alter the trajectory of French and global history. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, became a symbol of the people's defiance against the monarchy. It was not the political elites who seized the Bastille, but the common folk of Paris, workers, artisans, and laborers, who saw in the prison a symbol of the tyranny they had endured for so long. Their act of rebellion was not just a fight against the monarchy but a fight for the right to live in a society that valued their voices, their contributions, and their humanity. The French Revolution was a tumultuous and violent period in history, but it was also a time when the common people's demands for equality, liberty, and fraternity began to shape the ideals of the modern world. The revolution eventually led to the overthrow of the monarchy, the rise of the republic, and the establishment of new ideals of democracy and human rights. It is easy to view the French Revolution as a series of grand political movements: Jacobin rule, the Reign of Terror, the rise of Napoleon. But beneath these external events lay the true force of the revolution: the common people who had had enough of being silenced and oppressed. It was their hunger for justice, their desire for equality, that sparked the flames of revolution. Similarly, the Russian Revolution of 1917, which led to the downfall of the Romanov monarchy and the rise of Bolshevik power, was not driven solely by political elites or intellectuals. It was driven by the suffering of the common people, particularly the workers and peasants, who had long been denied their basic rights. For years, Russia had been under the oppressive rule of Tsar Nicholas II, who maintained an autocratic regime that ignored the needs of the people. The situation became unbearable, and by 1917, a combination of economic hardship, military defeats in World War I, and widespread dissatisfaction with the monarchy led to mass uprisings. In February 1917, strikes and protests erupted in Petrograd, leading to the abdication of the Tsar and the establishment of a provisional government. The revolution was fueled not just by political ideologies but by the everyday struggles of the Russian people. The soldiers who had fought in the trenches of the Great War were tired and disillusioned, while the workers in the cities were exhausted by years of exploitation. The common folk, tired of being oppressed, rose up against a system that had denied them their basic rights and dignity. It was their struggle, not just the ideologies of Lenin or Trotsky, that carried the revolution forward. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, they did so not just with political ideology but with the support of the workers, the soldiers, and the peasants who had fought for their cause. The Russian Revolution was, in many ways, the triumph of the common people, who, against all odds, managed to reshape the political and social landscape of Russia. As we look at the history of these revolutions, we begin to see a pattern emerge. The common folk, despite their apparent insignificance, are often the true agents of change. They may not have the wealth or political power to influence the course of events directly, but when they come together, when they rise in defiance, they possess a power that is impossible to ignore. Their actions, driven by a deep sense of justice and a refusal to accept oppression, have reshaped the world in ways that the political elites never anticipated. Even today, we continue to witness the power of the common folk in shaping history. Movements like the Arab Spring, the global climate strikes led by young activists like Greta Thunberg, and the ongoing struggles for racial justice all share a common thread. They are fueled by ordinary people who are tired of waiting for change to come from above. These movements, like those of the past, remind us that history is not solely made by the powerful. It is made by the people, the workers, the activists, the marginalized, who, when pushed to the edge, have the power to reshape the world in their image. The Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, these are just a few examples of how the common folk have changed the course of history. But their impact goes far beyond these famous events. The power of the common folk lies not just in the revolutions they spark, but in the quiet resistance they embody every day. Whether through labor strikes, protests, or the simple act of standing up for their rights, the common folk continue to be the driving force behind history. It is their stories, often forgotten or overlooked, that make up the true narrative of human progress. History may remember the kings, the generals, and the intellectuals who led these revolutions, but it is the common people, whose names are often lost to time, who have truly shaped the world. Their courage, their resilience, and their refusal to be silenced are the true engines of change. Their struggles, though often forgotten in the grand narratives of history, continue to resonate today. When we look at the revolutions of the past, we are reminded that the power to change the world lies not in the hands of the few but in the collective will of the many. The common folk, when they rise, are unstoppable. The thread of resistance woven through the fabric of history by the common folk is often more complex and nuanced than many of the larger, more publicized movements that dominate the historical record. These are not merely stories of outright revolution or violent conflict. They are also stories of quiet rebellion, of resilience in the face of injustice, and of ordinary individuals and communities finding the courage to assert their dignity and rights in the most oppressive of conditions. What these stories reveal is not just the eventual victory of the underdog but the enduring human spirit, the unyielding force that continues to shape societies in ways that we often overlook or fail to appreciate fully. The common folk, with their everyday struggles and small victories, have always been the true architects of societal change, even when their contributions go largely unrecognized by the powers that be. Throughout history, the seeds of change have often been planted in the least likely places, in the slums of cities, in the villages of rural lands, and in the fields of labor. These places, far removed from the gilded halls of power, have often been the breeding grounds for the movements that would ultimately shift the course of history. In many ways, the common folk represent the heartbeat of history itself, moving in response to the rhythms of social, political, and economic forces that can seem completely out of their control. Yet, it is often their collective actions, fueled by a shared sense of injustice and a desire for change, that set the wheels of revolution into motion. One of the most profound examples of this power can be found in the rise of peasant revolts during the medieval period. While these revolts are often framed in the context of economic hardship and exploitation, they are also driven by something much deeper, a desire for recognition and for an acknowledgement of the humanity of those who were relegated to the lowest rungs of society. The medieval peasant, whether in England, France, or elsewhere in Europe, was often subjected to a life of serfdom, bound to the land by feudal obligations and stripped of any real autonomy. The peasants' labor was the backbone of the entire feudal system, yet they were denied even the most basic human rights. They had little control over their own lives, their bodies, or their futures. And yet, despite this overwhelming oppression, there were moments throughout history when they rose up in defiance. Perhaps one of the most famous of these revolts was the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. Triggered by a series of burdensome taxes and the economic hardships brought on by the Black Death, which had ravaged the population and left much of the countryside decimated, the peasants began to challenge the oppressive system that kept them in servitude. The spark that ignited the revolt was the imposition of a poll tax, which was seen as an unfair burden on the poor, particularly at a time when much of the labor force had been wiped out by disease. The revolt spread quickly, with peasants marching toward London, demanding the abolition of the poll tax and greater freedoms for the lower classes. At its core, the peasants' revolt was not just about taxes or economic hardship. It was about the demand for a more just society. The peasants were fighting for the right to live free from the arbitrary rule of the nobility, for the right to own land, and for the right to be seen as equals in the eyes of the law. The revolt culminated in the capture and killing of several high-ranking officials, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the burning of records that represented the feudal system. Though the revolt was ultimately crushed, it is remembered as a turning point in English history, a moment when the common folk stood up and said, "We will no longer be silent." Even though the demands of the peasants were not immediately met, the rebellion forced the elites to take notice. It was a clear signal that the old feudal order was beginning to crumble, and that the voices of the common people could no longer be ignored. The peasants' revolt is just one example of how the common folk, through sheer force of will and collective action, have been able to challenge oppressive systems. But the story of the rise of the common people in history is not confined to any one period, region, or movement. The struggles of ordinary men and women have spanned centuries, taking many forms and involving countless individuals who, despite the odds, found ways to resist the systems of power that sought to subjugate them. These movements have often been born in response to deep social, political, and economic inequalities, and while their specific demands may vary, they all share a common thread: the desire for justice, for recognition, and for dignity. Consider the labor movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, which, though often overshadowed by the grand political ideologies that accompanied them, were primarily driven by the struggles of workers, men and women who endured grueling labor conditions in factories, mines, and mills, often for little more than subsistence wages. The industrial age was a time of unprecedented growth and innovation, but it was also a time of intense exploitation. The factory system, which fueled the economies of the West, was built on the backs of workers who were often treated as little more than machines. They were forced to work long hours in unsafe conditions, often under the watchful eyes of foremen who viewed them as nothing more than cogs in the great wheel of production. But despite the oppressive environment, these workers, many of whom had no formal education or political training, began to organize and demand better conditions. The labor movements that emerged during this period were often sparked by small, localized struggles, strikes over wages, disputes over working conditions, or protests against child labor. These small actions would eventually snowball into larger, more organized movements that transcended national borders and forced governments to reckon with the rights of workers. In many cases, these movements were met with violent repression by the state, which saw the demands of the workers as a threat to the established order. Yet, despite the harsh tactics used to quell dissent, the labor movement continued to grow, and its successes, better wages, shorter working hours, and the right to form unions, laid the foundation for the social safety nets and labor rights that we take for granted today. The success of the labor movement was not the result of political elites or intellectuals. It was the result of ordinary workers, coming together in solidarity to demand their rights. Similarly, the struggles of women in the 19th and early 20th centuries offer another powerful example of how the common folk have shaped history through collective action. Women, long relegated to the private sphere and denied basic rights such as the right to vote, began to demand equality and recognition in ways that were both radical and transformative. The suffrage movements that emerged in both Europe and the United States were not simply about women wanting to participate in the political process. They were about women demanding their rightful place in society. The suffragists were fighting not just for a political right, but for the recognition of their humanity, for the acknowledgement that they, too, were capable of contributing to the shaping of their societies. The suffrage movement was, at its core, a movement of the common folk, working-class women, homemakers, and intellectuals, who, despite the challenges they faced, united to challenge the patriarchal systems that had kept them in subjugation for centuries. These women, many of whom faced ridicule, imprisonment, and violence, fought not just for themselves, but for future generations. Their success, culminating in the passage of the 19th Amendment in the United States and similar victories around the world, was a testament to the power of grassroots organizing and the unyielding spirit of those who refused to accept injustice. The civil rights movements of the 20th century, from the American Civil Rights Movement to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, also exemplify the power of the common folk in driving social change. The stories of Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Nelson Mandela are often told as the stories of exceptional individuals, but what is often overlooked is the collective power of the masses who supported them. It was the courage of the ordinary people, black men and women, working-class citizens, and students, that gave the movement its power. They were the ones who marched in the streets, who sat at lunch counters, who endured violence and imprisonment for the cause of equality. Without their tireless efforts, the successes of the civil rights movement would not have been possible. The civil rights movements, like the labor and suffrage movements before them, were not just about winning specific rights. They were about challenging the very systems that kept people in subjugation, that denied them their humanity. They were about demanding recognition not just for the political rights of individuals, but for the social and cultural recognition of entire groups of people who had long been marginalized. In every one of these movements, the common folk, ordinary men and women, played the pivotal role. They were the ones who carried the banner of change, who pushed forward despite overwhelming odds, and who were often the ones to bear the brunt of the violence and oppression. And while the names of their leaders are remembered, it is the collective actions of the people that form the true backbone of these movements. History often remembers the elites, the politicians, the generals, and the intellectuals who supposedly shaped the course of events. But it is the common folk, those who have the least in terms of material wealth and political power, who are the true agents of change. Throughout history, the struggle for freedom, justice, and dignity has been carried on the backs of the ordinary people. Their lives were often bound by the chains of poverty, exploitation, and oppression, and yet, time and again, they have risen to challenge the systems that sought to keep them down. These are not the stories that make the front pages of history books, but they are the ones that shape the world we live in today. The power of the common folk lies not in their wealth, political influence, or military might, but in their resilience, their ability to unite for a common cause, and their refusal to accept the status quo. History often celebrates the victories of the elites, the generals, and the philosophers, but the real stories of transformation are written in the blood, sweat, and tears of the people who fought for a better life. One of the most compelling aspects of these struggles is the way they often unfold from the ground up. Change does not begin with the powerful making decisions in boardrooms or behind the walls of palatial government buildings. It begins with the ordinary people who live in the shadows of those institutions, whose voices are ignored and whose needs are overlooked. The struggles of the common folk are often seen as insignificant in the eyes of the elites, who fail to recognize the latent power that lies within the masses. But it is from this very power, this collective force, that revolutions are born. In the late 18th century, for instance, the French Revolution erupted not from a desire for political power by the ruling elite, but from the deep-rooted resentment of the common people who had been burdened by a feudal system that left them destitute and voiceless. The aristocracy and clergy lived in unimaginable luxury, while the peasants and working class struggled to survive. The system was unsustainable, and the growing economic crisis pushed the people to the brink. But the rebellion was not just about food prices or taxes. It was a cry for justice, for an acknowledgement of the humanity of those who had been ignored for so long. The revolution began not with the signing of treaties or declarations of war, but with a simple, powerful act, the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was a symbol of the monarchy's absolute power, a prison where political prisoners were held, and for the people it represented the very essence of their oppression. When the common folk took control of the Bastille, they were not just attacking a building. They were attacking the entire system of inequality and subjugation that had kept them powerless for centuries. The French Revolution was a dramatic and violent uprising, but at its heart, it was the collective will of the common people who were tired of living under the thumb of an oppressive system. The revolution gave birth to the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but it also showed the world that the power of the people could no longer be ignored. While the revolution itself was chaotic and bloody, it marked the beginning of a shift in the way society viewed the relationship between the rulers and the ruled. The common people were no longer content to live in the shadows. They had found their voice, and they demanded to be heard. Though the revolution did not immediately deliver all of its promises, it set the stage for future movements that would continue to fight for the rights of the common folk. The American Revolution of the late 18th century offers another example of how the ordinary people, in their struggle for justice and freedom, can fundamentally alter the course of history. The American Revolution is often portrayed as a conflict between the colonies and the British Empire, but beneath the surface, it was also a rebellion by ordinary men and women who were tired of living under the control of a distant monarchy. While the British elite sought to maintain their power over the colonies, the colonists were increasingly aware of their rights and their potential to govern themselves. The revolution was sparked by a number of issues, including taxation without representation and the desire for self-determination. But at its core, the American Revolution was a fight for the rights of the common folk to shape their own future. The American Revolution was not fought by kings or generals alone. It was fought by farmers, artisans, and laborers who were willing to lay down their lives for the idea of liberty and self-governance. These were not professional soldiers, but ordinary people who found themselves thrust into a struggle for freedom that they believed was worth the sacrifice. The battle at Lexington and Concord, which marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War, was not a grand military campaign, but a series of small skirmishes fought by local militias. It was the common folk who made up the majority of the Continental Army, who fought not for power or wealth but for the right to be free from the yoke of tyranny. Though the war was long and costly, the outcome was clear. The people had risen up against an empire and won their independence. However, while the American Revolution is often celebrated as a victory for freedom, it is important to recognize that the revolution did not deliver equality for all. The struggle for freedom was, in many ways, incomplete. The fight for civil rights, for the abolition of slavery, and for gender equality would continue long after the Revolutionary War had ended. Yet, the American Revolution laid the groundwork for future struggles by showing that the common folk could rise up and create the change they desired. The revolution was not just about the establishment of a new government. It was about the idea that ordinary people, even those with no political power, could shape the future of their nation. The Industrial Revolution in the 19th century marked another pivotal moment in the history of the common folk struggle for dignity and justice. The rise of industrialization brought about unprecedented economic growth, but it also led to the exploitation of workers on an unimaginable scale. Factory workers, many of whom were women and children, labored long hours in unsafe conditions for little pay. The rapid pace of industrialization created a new class of laborers, men, women, and children who worked in grueling conditions in factories, mines, and mills. These workers, despite their essential role in the production process, were treated as mere commodities. They had no rights, no protections, and no voice in the systems that controlled their lives. But as industrialization progressed, so too did the realization among workers that they could change their circumstances. Workers began to organize themselves into unions, demanding better wages, safer working conditions, and a reduction in working hours. The labor movements that arose in response to industrial exploitation were not born from the ideas of the wealthy or the educated elite, but from the everyday experiences of those who lived and worked in the factories. These movements were driven by a simple but powerful idea: that every person, regardless of their station in life, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The success of these labor movements, which led to the establishment of labor laws, workers' rights, and social safety nets, did not come easily. The ruling class fought to preserve the status quo, using violence, intimidation, and political influence to maintain control. However, the workers' demands could not be ignored, and over time, the hard-won victories of the labor movement led to significant changes in the lives of the common people. The establishment of labor unions, the introduction of minimum wage laws, and the fight for better working conditions were all the result of the collective action of ordinary people who were willing to stand up and fight for their rights. In more recent times, the struggles of the common folk continue to shape the world in profound ways. The civil rights movements of the 20th century, particularly the American Civil Rights Movement, demonstrate the power of ordinary people to challenge deeply ingrained systems of racism and inequality. The movement was sparked by the brave actions of individuals like Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus, and Martin Luther King Jr., who led countless marches, speeches, and protests to demand justice for African Americans. But while these figures are well known, the true strength of the civil rights movement came from the ordinary people who supported it, the men and women who participated in the marches, who risked their lives to challenge segregation, and who stood together to demand equality. Their actions forced a nation to confront its racial injustices and laid the foundation for future movements for racial and social justice. The success of the civil rights movement is a powerful reminder that, while the road to social change is long and often filled with obstacles, the common folk have always had the power to bring about change. The same is true of the struggles for women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and environmental justice that continue to shape the modern world. These movements may face opposition, but they are driven by the collective will of ordinary people who refuse to be silenced. Ultimately, the stories of the common folk are the stories of humanity itself. They are the stories of individuals who, despite the odds, have stood up to systems of power that sought to keep them oppressed. They are the stories of people who, in their struggle for justice and equality, have changed the world for the better. And though their names may not always be remembered, their impact is felt in every corner of society, in every law that protects the rights of the disenfranchised, in every victory won by those who have fought for a better world. The common folk, whose voices have often been ignored, are the true architects of history. It is through their efforts that the world moves forward, towards a future where justice, dignity, and equality are no longer privileges for the few, but rights for all. The rise of movements driven by the common folk is not just a collection of isolated events. It is a thread that runs through the entire fabric of history, woven into the struggles and triumphs of those who have fought for justice, equality, and human dignity. The history of the common folk is filled with stories of those who, despite having little to lose, have managed to challenge the powerful forces that sought to keep them in subjugation. They have not only fought for their own survival but have worked to reshape entire societies, often at great personal cost. These movements, while often overlooked in the grand narratives of history, are the true drivers of social change. In many ways, the story of the common folk struggle is the story of the human condition. It is the story of people who, in their darkest moments, find the courage to rise up against systems that have long oppressed them. Their stories are not always filled with victory or grand accomplishments. Often, they are stories of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience. But they are also stories of hope, of the belief that change is possible, and that a better future can be forged by those who refuse to accept the injustices of the present. One of the most compelling aspects of these movements is their ability to challenge the structures of power from within. While political revolutions and uprisings have often been driven by elite ideologies or external forces, the movements of the common folk are born out of the lived experiences of the people themselves. They are not abstract theories or intellectual debates. They are grounded in the day-to-day struggles of ordinary individuals who are simply trying to make a living, support their families, and live with dignity. These movements are often sparked by a single moment of injustice, a spark that ignites the collective fury of those who have been oppressed for too long. It is in these moments that the power of the common folk becomes apparent, as they rise up and demand to be heard. One of the most famous examples of this kind of movement is the labor movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries, which grew out of the brutal conditions faced by industrial workers in Europe and North America. The Industrial Revolution, while ushering in an era of technological progress and economic growth, also brought with it a dark side: the exploitation of workers. In factories, mines, and mills, workers, often including women and children, were subjected to grueling hours, unsafe working conditions, and miserably low wages. They were treated as little more than cogs in a machine. Their labor used to fuel the engines of industry while their humanity was ignored. But as the Industrial Revolution progressed, so too did the recognition among workers that they had the power to change their circumstances. They began to organize, to form unions, and to demand better wages, safer working conditions, and shorter hours. These demands were not driven by grand political ideologies or academic theories. They were born out of the everyday struggles of people who had been pushed to the brink by an inhumane system. The workers who went on strike, who organized protests, who fought for their rights, were not elites with access to power or wealth. They were ordinary men and women, just trying to survive, who decided that they would no longer accept their lot in life. The labor movement was not without its struggles. The ruling classes and industrialists fought back fiercely, using violence, intimidation, and political power to crush the uprisings. In the United States, for example, during the Pullman strike of 1894, thousands of railroad workers went on strike to protest wage cuts and poor working conditions. The strike was met with brutal force by the government, which sent in federal troops to break the strike and restore order. Despite the repression, the labor movement continued to grow. Workers in cities across the world continued to organize, and over time, their struggles began to pay off. Labor laws were passed, unions were legalized, and working conditions improved. These victories did not come overnight, nor did they come without sacrifice. But they marked a turning point in the way society viewed the rights of workers and the importance of their contributions to the economy. In the same way that the labor movement reshaped the economic landscape, the suffrage movements of the 19th and 20th centuries would forever alter the social and political fabric of many nations. For centuries, women had been relegated to the margins of society, denied basic rights such as the right to vote, to own property, or to pursue an education. In many cultures, women were seen as subordinate to men, their roles confined to the domestic sphere. This social structure was deeply entrenched, and any attempt to challenge it was met with fierce resistance. But the desire for change among women, driven by their shared experiences of injustice, was unstoppable. The suffrage movements were not led by elites or the intellectuals of the time. They were led by ordinary women who were tired of being denied their basic rights. These women were mothers, daughters, workers, and activists who recognized that the struggle for women's rights was not just a matter of political participation. It was a matter of justice and dignity. They were fighting for recognition, not just for themselves but for all women who had been silenced for so long. In the United States, the suffrage movement gained momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, culminating in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. But the struggle did not end there. The fight for gender equality continued, with women fighting for equal access to education, employment, and reproductive rights. In the United Kingdom, women like Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes were arrested, imprisoned, and even force-fed for their activism. But they remained steadfast in their determination to secure the right to vote for women. Their courage and determination set the stage for future generations of women to fight for their rights, and their legacy can still be seen in the ongoing struggles for gender equality today. The civil rights movements of the 20th century are another prime example of how the common folk have been at the forefront of social change. The American civil rights movement, in particular, was not led by powerful politicians or celebrities. It was driven by the collective action of ordinary black men and women who were fed up with the institutionalized racism that permeated American society. From the moment that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus, to the marches and protests organized by Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement was driven by the resolve of those who had been oppressed for centuries. These were people who had lived in a world where they were denied basic rights, where they were treated as second-class citizens, simply because of the color of their skin. The civil rights movement was not only a struggle for political rights. It was a battle for the recognition of the humanity and dignity of African Americans. The movement gained national attention as African Americans organized mass protests, sit-ins, and marches to demand justice. Though many of these protests were met with violence and hostility, the determination of the common folk never wavered. In 1963, for example, more than 250,000 people gathered for the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. This was not the work of a single leader or a few political elites. It was the collective effort of thousands of ordinary people who had come together to demand equality and justice. The success of the civil rights movement is a testament to the power of collective action, of ordinary people uniting to challenge deeply entrenched systems of racism and discrimination. The fight for civil rights and equality did not end with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It continues today, as new generations of activists fight for racial justice, LGBTQ rights, and the rights of immigrants and other marginalized groups. The common folk are still at the forefront of these struggles, using their voices, their bodies, and their collective strength to demand a more just and equal society. From the Black Lives Matter movement to the global fight for gender equality, the common folk are once again proving that they are the true agents of social change. But these movements are not confined to the United States or to the past. Around the world, the common folk have risen up to challenge authoritarian regimes, to demand democracy, and to fight for freedom. The Arab Spring, for example, was a series of uprisings that spread across the Middle East and North Africa in 2010 and 2011. It began with a single act of defiance. A Tunisian street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire in protest of police corruption and abuse. His death sparked protests across Tunisia, which in turn inspired uprisings in Egypt, Libya, Syria, and other countries. These movements, though often brutally suppressed, showed that the common people, even in the most repressive regimes, could rise up against tyranny. In each of these movements, the power of the common folk has been undeniable. Whether in the streets of Paris, the cotton fields of the South, the factories of the industrial age, or the cities of the Middle East, the story is the same. Ordinary people, when they come together in pursuit of a common goal, can change the world. The struggles of the common folk are not always won immediately, and the road to justice is often long and filled with obstacles. But these movements are the foundation of every significant social, political, and economic change in history. The common folk may not always be the ones to write the history books, but they are the ones who shape the course of history itself. Their actions, their resistance, their courage, and their solidarity are the forces that continue to drive humanity forward. In many ways, history is shaped by the small, seemingly insignificant acts of rebellion, dissent, and defiance that echo through the corridors of time. These are not the grand revolutions or wars that dominate the history books. They are the quiet, unassuming movements of common people whose lives are typically considered inconsequential. Yet, it is precisely these individuals, the farmers, the workers, the mothers, and the children who have had an outsized impact on the world. The struggle for freedom, justice, and equality is not simply the work of great men or political leaders. It is a collective endeavor, driven by the everyday people who rise up when they are pushed to the brink. This collective resistance, this unyielding drive for change, has often been the force that has shaped the destiny of nations. Take, for example, the way that early labor movements transformed the industrialized world. The Industrial Revolution, a period of profound economic and social change, did not only bring advancements in technology and wealth, but also widespread exploitation. Factory workers, many of whom were women and children, endured long hours in dangerous conditions, receiving barely enough pay to sustain themselves. They were treated as little more than machines in the factory system, their humanity disregarded in the relentless drive for profit. The wealthy owners and managers of factories viewed these workers as expendable, merely tools to maximize production. Yet, from the depths of this exploitation came a revolutionary force, the collective will of the working class. The early labor movements were often small and localized, the actions of individual workers or groups of workers who dared to challenge their conditions. Strikes, protests, and petitions were some of the first tools of resistance used by these workers, often against overwhelming odds. In the beginning, these efforts seemed futile. The ruling class and the state were united in their determination to maintain the status quo, and they used their power to crush the uprisings. Police forces, armed with rifles and batons, would break up strikes with brute force, and striking workers were often labeled as criminals or subversives. Yet, despite the violence and repression, the spirit of resistance refused to be extinguished. Over time, these scattered efforts grew into larger movements. Unions began to form, providing workers with a collective voice to negotiate with employers. Through these unions, workers were able to demand better wages, safer working conditions, and the right to organize without fear of retribution. While the path was not easy, and many workers lost their lives in the struggle, these movements eventually led to significant improvements in labor rights. The victory of the common folk in the labor movement did not just benefit the workers of their time. It paved the way for future generations to live and work with dignity, shaping the modern world of work and establishing rights that are taken for granted today. But the history of these movements is more than just the story of wages and working hours. It is the story of people refusing to accept their subjugation, of ordinary individuals rising up and demanding recognition, respect, and fairness. The suffrage movements provide another powerful example of how the common folk have shaped the course of history. For centuries, women were denied basic rights, including the right to vote, the right to own property, and the right to pursue careers or education. In many cultures, women were viewed as inferior to men, their roles confined to the domestic sphere, and their voices silenced in the public arena. Yet, throughout history, women have refused to accept this subjugation. Their fight for equality was not just about voting rights. It was about the recognition of their humanity and the right to determine their own destinies. The suffrage movements, which gained momentum in the 19th and early 20th centuries, were not the product of political elites or intellectuals. They were driven by ordinary women who were tired of being treated as second-class citizens. These women, from all walks of life, banded together to demand the right to vote. They endured mockery, imprisonment, and even violence in their fight for a simple but profound right: the ability to shape the future of their countries. Women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the United States, Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes in the United Kingdom, and countless others around the world, took to the streets, organized marches, and staged hunger strikes to demand their rights. While the struggle for women's rights was long and difficult, it eventually bore fruit. The suffrage movements led to the granting of voting rights to women in many countries, including the United States with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But the victories of the suffrage movements were not limited to the right to vote. They set the stage for broader struggles for gender equality, including the fight for equal access to education, the right to work, and reproductive rights. The suffrage movements were about more than just the legal right to vote. They were about asserting the value and worth of women as equal members of society. However, the common folk's contributions to history are not confined to social movements within the borders of specific nations. The struggle for justice and freedom has been a global endeavor, with ordinary people rising up against oppressive systems and regimes across the world. One of the most profound examples of this is the global anti-colonial movement, which brought an end to the colonial empires that had dominated the world for centuries. Colonization, driven by the pursuit of wealth and power, subjected millions of people to exploitation, oppression, and cultural erasure. The colonial powers, which included Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, viewed the people they colonized as inferior, denying them basic rights and freedoms. Yet, Despite the overwhelming odds, resistance to colonial rule was a constant presence throughout history. The first signs of resistance came in the form of small, localized uprisings, often led by local leaders or guerrilla groups. These early rebellions were often crushed by the superior military forces of the colonial powers, but the seeds of resistance had been planted. Over time, these scattered efforts grew into larger, more coordinated movements for independence. From the ashes of colonization rose the demands for self-determination and the right to govern one's own land. In India, for example, the struggle for independence was led by Mahatma Gandhi, whose philosophy of nonviolent resistance inspired millions of Indians to join the movement for freedom. Gandhi's leadership helped transform the fight for independence into a mass movement that united people across class, caste, and religious lines. The Indian independence movement was not just about the removal of British rulers. It was about the right of the Indian people to govern themselves, to shape their own future, and to reclaim their dignity as human beings. Similarly, in Africa, the fight for independence was a long and painful struggle, with ordinary Africans rising up against the colonial powers that had exploited them for centuries. The stories of figures like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and Patrice Lumumba in the Congo are often celebrated as the stories of great leaders. Yet, these leaders were not working in isolation. They were the voice of the common people, the laborers, the farmers, the teachers, and the children, who had long endured the horrors of colonialism. These movements were not just political in nature. They were social, cultural, and emotional, as the people fought not just for political independence but for the restoration of their dignity and identity. The global anti-colonial movements, while varying in methods and outcomes, all shared a common thread: the power of the people. The common folk were the heart of these struggles, and their collective will was the force that drove the movements forward. While the colonial powers had vast armies and resources at their disposal, they could not crush the spirit of a people determined to reclaim their freedom. In the end, it was the ordinary people, those whose lives had been shaped by colonial rule, who triumphed. They were the ones who reshaped the world map, who carved out new nations, and who defined the future of their countries. The common folk's role in shaping history extends beyond the battlefield or the protest march. In everyday acts of resistance, in the choices made by individuals to stand up for what is right, the people have continually reshaped the course of history. In the face of tyranny, injustice, and oppression, the people have always found ways to resist. Whether through rebellion, protest, or quiet defiance, they have shown that the power to change the world lies not in the hands of a few elites but in the collective strength of ordinary people. These stories, though often overlooked, are the true backbone of history. The common folk who have been dismissed, ignored, or oppressed have been the ones to spark revolutions, demand justice, and secure the rights and freedoms we often take for granted. They may not always be the ones who are remembered or celebrated, but their impact is undeniable. In every moment of resistance, in every act of defiance, the common folk have shown that history is not just made by the powerful, but by the millions of voices that rise up to change the world. And their legacy continues to inspire new generations to fight for justice, equality, and a better future for all. History is full of the stories of those whose actions have changed the course of events, often in ways that were entirely unanticipated at the time. For the most part, these stories are told through the lens of political leaders, military commanders, or intellectual figures who are seen as the architects of change. However, beneath the surface, there are countless untold stories that reflect a much more subtle yet equally powerful force in history: the collective efforts of the common people. The invisible hands that shaped revolutions, overthrew empires, and shifted the tides of progress were not always the ones wielding power or commanding armies. They were the farmers, laborers, housewives, students, and ordinary workers, many of whom were often unaware that their small, seemingly insignificant actions were laying the foundation for monumental societal changes. The power of the common folk often lies in their ability to coalesce around a shared cause, a deep sense of injustice, or an innate desire for a better life. While history is often narrated from the perspective of the powerful, the true stories of transformation begin with the voices that were once silenced, the lives that were deemed unimportant, and the communities that stood on the periphery of the empire's grandeur. These voices, when gathered in unison, create a force that can change the world. It is through their struggles, their courage, and their unity that new possibilities emerge, and society is often forced to confront the injustices that it has long ignored. In the early 20th century, for instance, one of the most dramatic shifts in modern history came from a place that was not often seen as a bastion of political or social change: the factory floor. In the early days of industrialization, workers were often treated as little more than commodities. The rise of factories brought the promise of economic prosperity, but it also introduced brutal working conditions, child labor, and wages that barely sustained families. Factory workers, who often worked 12-hour days in unsafe and unsanitary conditions, lived lives of misery and exploitation. Despite their central role in producing the goods that fueled the Industrial Revolution, they had little to no control over their lives or working conditions. But in the heart of this exploitation, the spark of resistance began to take form. The early labor movements were born from the shared hardships of these workers. They were the product of collective outrage at the systemic injustices they endured daily. What began as small-scale strikes and petitions soon grew into large, organized labor unions. These unions, though initially weak and often crushed by violence and repression, became powerful symbols of workers' rights, the fight for dignity, and the struggle for justice. These workers, often seen as the lowest class, the unseen laborers behind the production of goods, came together to demand better wages, shorter working hours, and safer conditions. They were ordinary people who had no political power, no wealth, and no formal education. What they had was a shared sense of injustice and a collective will to fight for a better life. The rise of the labor movement in the 19th century became a powerful testament to the ability of common folk to reshape the structure of society. In the United States, the Pullman Strike of 1894, which involved railroad workers protesting wage cuts and high rents, and the subsequent violent crackdown, demonstrated the lengths to which the establishment would go to preserve the existing social order. Yet, despite the defeat, the labor movement continued to grow. Over time, the labor struggle resulted in the establishment of labor laws, the protection of workers' rights, and the creation of the 40-hour workweek that many people take for granted today. These victories were not granted by the powerful but were won by the collective efforts of workers who fought to claim their dignity. Their persistence, despite the seemingly insurmountable odds, is a reminder that the struggles of the common folk can often be the catalysts for sweeping societal changes. At the same time, movements for social and political rights were gaining momentum in other parts of the world. In the early 20th century, the suffrage movements, driven by ordinary women, were gaining strength across the world. Women, who had long been denied the right to vote, were beginning to rise up and demand equality. The suffrage movements were not led by the political elites or the intellectuals of society. Rather, they were driven by the everyday women who were tired of being treated as second-class citizens. Women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the United States, Emmeline Pankhurst in the United Kingdom, and many others around the world organized protests, marches, and hunger strikes to demand the right to vote. They faced imprisonment, violence, and scorn, but they persisted. Their struggle was not just about gaining the right to vote. It was about asserting their right to exist as full members of society. The suffrage movement did not just change the political landscape. It changed the way that women were perceived, opening the door for further movements for gender equality and the recognition of women's rights in all aspects of life. The suffragists and suffragettes were ordinary women who, in the face of overwhelming opposition, refused to be silenced. Their movements were not just about political participation. They were about acknowledging that women, too, had a right to influence the decisions that shaped their lives. And, in the end, their struggle led to the passage of laws that enfranchised women in many countries. This, in turn, paved the way for the broader struggle for women's equality in education, employment, and social rights. The suffragists did not just change the course of political history. They also changed the social fabric of nations, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to women's increased participation in all areas of society. Their persistence, despite the obstacles they faced, is a testament to the power of ordinary people to change the world, even when the forces of resistance seem insurmountable. The labor and suffrage movements were not isolated events. They were part of a larger global trend in which ordinary people, inspired by shared experiences of injustice and exploitation, began to organize and demand their rights. This trend was especially prominent in the mid-20th century when the world was undergoing radical shifts in political and social landscapes. One of the most striking examples of this is the civil rights movement in the United States, where ordinary black men and women came together to challenge the deeply entrenched system of racial segregation and discrimination. The movement did not begin with great political leaders or famous intellectuals. It began in the streets, in the everyday lives of black Americans who were tired of being treated as second-class citizens. The civil rights movement was fueled by the collective anger and frustration of ordinary black Americans who had lived under the oppressive yoke of segregation for decades. The movement's leaders, like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, were not the first to speak out against racial injustice. The real force behind the movement was the people who took to the streets, participated in sit-ins, and staged boycotts to demand an end to racial segregation. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus, it was a small act of defiance that catalyzed a larger movement for change. Parks' simple act of resistance reverberated across the nation, spurring the Montgomery bus boycott and catalyzing the broader civil rights movement. As the movement gained momentum, it became clear that the common folk, those who had long been oppressed and disenfranchised, were the true agents of change. The movement culminated in the passage of landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin and protected the voting rights of African Americans. These victories did not come easily. They were the result of decades of struggle, sacrifice, and resistance by everyday people who, despite the overwhelming power of the state and the forces of segregation, fought for their dignity and their rights. Even beyond the United States, similar struggles were playing out across the world. In Africa, the end of colonialism was similarly driven by the collective efforts of ordinary people who were determined to gain their independence. In countries like Ghana, Kenya, and Algeria, the common folk rose up against their colonial oppressors, often through guerrilla warfare, protests, and mass uprisings. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Ahmed Ben Bella were at the forefront of these movements, but they were not acting alone. They were the voices of the millions of Africans who had endured the horrors of colonial exploitation and were determined to free their nations from foreign rule. The independence movements were not simply about national sovereignty. They were about reclaiming the dignity of the African people, who had been subjected to centuries of exploitation, violence, and cultural erasure. The struggles of the common folk for freedom, dignity, and equality are not confined to any one region or time period. They are part of the ongoing narrative of human history. While these movements often begin with the smallest, most seemingly insignificant acts of resistance, they eventually snowball into powerful forces for change. The common folk, those who have been overlooked, exploited, and silenced, are the true agents of transformation. Their struggles may not always be recorded in the annals of history, but their actions have shaped the world in profound and lasting ways. In every movement, in every struggle, the power of ordinary people to reshape the world remains undeniable. Through their unity, their resolve, and their unyielding belief in a better future, they prove that history is not made by the powerful alone but by the collective action of the people. History, as it is often told, is a story of elites and monarchs, generals and presidents, those who wield power and control the destinies of nations. These figures dominate the textbooks, their names etched in the annals of history, their actions and decisions shaping the course of empires and revolutions. But history, in its true form, is not a linear progression dictated solely by these powerful figures. It is shaped by the voices of those who have been ignored or silenced, by the millions of common folk whose lives, while often considered insignificant, are the very foundation upon which great changes are built. These are the voices of the peasants, the workers, the laborers, the outcasts, and the marginalized who, often without even realizing it, change the course of history with their resilience, their dreams, and their acts of rebellion. The common folk, in their struggles, embody the essence of humanity's resistance against oppression, inequality, and injustice. They are the people who stand at the margins of society, often seen as invisible, their lives disregarded in the face of larger political or economic forces. Yet, history is full of examples where these very people, when united, have been capable of shifting the axis of power. When they rise up, their voices reverberate across the world, leaving an indelible mark on society. Their actions may not always be recorded in the grandiose chronicles of history, but they have the power to dismantle empires, challenge societal norms, and redefine the structures that govern our lives. One of the most profound ways in which the common folk reshape history is through the force of rebellion. Rebellion, in its many forms, has been a constant throughout human history. Whether it is the violent overthrow of a ruling power or the quiet defiance of an individual, rebellion represents the refusal to accept the status quo. It is the moment when people, often faced with unbearable circumstances, come together to demand change. These acts of rebellion, though they may seem small or inconsequential in the moment, have often been the tipping point that has led to major societal upheavals. Consider the early revolutions of the modern era. The French Revolution, one of the most significant events in world history, did not begin with the plans of the elite or with a well-organized political movement. It began in the streets and on the farms with the common people, those who were hungry, oppressed, and disenfranchised, rising up against the monarchy and the aristocracy. The masses, those who had long borne the brunt of the economic and social inequality, demanded a voice in their government. While the revolution itself was complex and multifaceted, its spark was lit by the collective will of ordinary men and women who could no longer endure the crushing weight of poverty and exploitation. It was a revolt not just against the monarchy, but against a system that had long ignored the needs and desires of the common people. The outcome of this revolution, the fall of the Bastille, the rise of the French Republic, and the eventual spread of democratic ideals across Europe, was a direct result of the collective action of the people. The French Revolution was not the only uprising that had such profound consequences. Across the world, the voices of the oppressed have risen up to challenge the systems of power that sought to keep them subjugated. The Haitian Revolution, for instance, was one of the first successful slave revolts in history. In the late 18th century, the enslaved people of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, rose up against their masters, fighting for their freedom and the abolition of slavery. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, the revolutionaries fought against the French colonial powers and the brutal system of slavery that had sustained the colonial economy. It was a revolution driven by the common folk, by the enslaved, who refused to be treated as property any longer. Their victory led to the establishment of the first independent Black Republic and served as an inspiration for other slave uprisings and the broader abolitionist movement. In both the French and Haitian revolutions, the power of the common folk was evident. These uprisings were not just about political power or economic gain. They were about human dignity, the right to freedom, and the refusal to remain silent in the face of oppression. The rebels in both cases were not the rulers or the intellectuals. They were ordinary people, many of whom had little to lose but their chains. Yet, their collective will change the course of history, shaking the foundations of old regimes and setting the stage for a new era of democratic ideals and human rights. These revolutions were not isolated events. Around the world, the common folk have continued to rise up against tyranny, injustice, and inequality. In the 20th century, the civil rights movements in the United States, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and the independence movements across Africa were all driven by ordinary people who were fed up with being treated as second-class citizens. These movements were not led by powerful elites. They were led by the everyday people who suffered the consequences of discrimination, segregation, and colonialism. Figures like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Mahatma Gandhi became the faces of these movements, but they were speaking on behalf of millions of common folk who had been oppressed for generations. In the United States, the civil rights movement was born from the everyday struggles of African Americans who had been denied basic rights and freedoms for centuries. It was a movement led by ordinary men and women who were determined to secure the same rights as white Americans. The movement was marked by protests, sit-ins, boycotts, and legal battles that ultimately led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These victories were not the result of political elites or the powerful. They were the result of the collective action of the common folk, who risked their lives to demand equality and justice. Similarly, in South Africa, the struggle against apartheid was a movement led by ordinary black South Africans who fought for their right to live in a society free from racial segregation and oppression. The eventual fall of apartheid was not simply the result of international pressure or negotiations between leaders. It was the result of decades of resistance, led by the common people, who refused to accept the oppressive system any longer. But the power of the common folk is not only evident in large-scale political revolutions or social movements. It can also be seen in smaller, more personal acts of resistance. These small acts, often invisible to the larger world, are no less powerful. For example, consider the countless acts of defiance that took place during the era of slavery in the United States. Enslaved people who managed to escape to freedom through the Underground Railroad or who resisted their masters in small, subtle ways, by breaking tools, feigning illness, or even refusing to work, were engaging in acts of rebellion. These acts, though they may seem small in comparison to the larger movements, were part of a larger collective effort that eventually brought an end to slavery. The actions of these ordinary people, though often unseen by the larger world, were an essential part of the struggle for freedom and equality. Similarly, in the context of colonialism, many of the most powerful acts of resistance came from the common folk who fought not with weapons or armies but with their everyday actions. In India, for example, the British colonial authorities relied on the cooperation of the Indian people to maintain their empire. Yet, as the Indian independence movement gained momentum, millions of ordinary Indians refused to cooperate. They boycotted British goods, refused to pay taxes, and even went on mass strikes. These acts of nonviolent resistance, though often dismissed by the colonial authorities as insignificant, were a key factor in the eventual collapse of the British Empire in India. The common folk, united in their resistance, brought about the end of an empire. The struggles of the common folk are not always about overthrowing political systems or changing the course of history in a dramatic way. Sometimes, they are about smaller, everyday acts of defiance against the injustices that permeate society. These acts may seem insignificant in the moment, but when taken together, they represent a powerful force for change. In every moment of resistance, in every action of rebellion, the common folk demonstrate that history is not solely shaped by the powerful or the elite. It is shaped by the collective will of the people, who, when they come together, can transform society in profound and lasting ways. The power of the common folk lies not in their ability to wield force or command armies, but in their ability to unite, to find strength in numbers, and to stand together in the face of adversity. Their voices, though often drowned out by the forces of power, are the voices that have shaped the world we live in today. It is through their struggles, their courage, and their determination that we are able to enjoy the freedoms and rights that we often take for granted. And though their stories may not always be remembered in the history books, their impact is undeniable. In the end, it is the common folk, the laborers, the farmers, the workers, the oppressed, who have been the true architects of history, shaping the world in ways that the powerful can never truly control. The enduring struggle for justice and equality has never been the work of just one person or one group. It has been a collective effort, shaped by those whose voices have too often been ignored by history, by the everyday people who were forced to live under oppressive systems, yet who found the courage to rise up and demand their rights. It is easy to think of revolutions, movements, and societal changes as grand events orchestrated by prominent leaders or intellectuals. While these figures play an important role, it is the common folk, those whose lives are rarely recorded in history books, who provide the fuel for these transformations. They are the backbone of change, the ones whose everyday acts of defiance and solidarity push societies to evolve. Throughout history, the efforts of the common folk have been at the heart of the most significant social, political, and cultural shifts. These are not the stories of kings or generals, nor the tales of ideologies dreamt up by elites, but rather the often invisible movements of ordinary people whose lives were intertwined with larger forces, and whose voices were drowned out by the powerful. And yet, in the smallest of their actions, in their collective cries for justice, in their relentless pursuit of freedom, we see the true engines of change. One of the clearest examples of this is the abolitionist movements that swept across the world in the 18th and 19th centuries. Slavery, which had existed in various forms for millennia, was one of the most deeply entrenched systems of exploitation in human history. For centuries, millions of people were born into bondage, subjected to brutal treatment, and denied their basic humanity. The system was supported by both political and economic powers that profited immensely from the labor of enslaved people. And yet, beneath the surface of this monstrous institution, there were countless acts of resistance and rebellion, carried out by those who had the most to lose, the enslaved people themselves. The abolition of slavery was not achieved overnight, nor was it the result of a singular event. It was the culmination of centuries of struggle, much of which was carried out by those who were considered property, not people. The most well-known abolitionists, figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Wilberforce, were the visible faces of the movement, but they were part of a much larger tapestry of resistance. In the United States, for example, the Underground Railroad, which helped hundreds of enslaved individuals escape to freedom, was run by a network of ordinary people, free blacks, Quakers, and white allies, who risked their own safety to defy the oppressive system of slavery. These people were not part of the political elite. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers who knew that the moral imperative of their actions outweighed the danger they faced. Similarly, in Haiti, the struggle for freedom from slavery culminated in the Haitian Revolution, the first successful slave revolt in history. Led by figures such as Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian people rose up against the French colonists who had enslaved them. It was a war fought not by the military elite, but by ordinary men and women, many of whom had never seen a battle before but had a deep, unyielding desire for freedom. The victory of the Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves throughout the world, sparking fear among colonial powers and inspiring slave revolts across the Americas. It was the ultimate demonstration of the power of the common people, those whom the system had sought to oppress and silence, demanding their rights and reclaiming their dignity. While slavery was one of the most brutal systems of exploitation, the fight for justice did not end with its abolition. The battle for civil rights, for the recognition of the equality of all human beings, continued throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and it is still being fought today. In the United States, the civil rights movement was a direct outgrowth of the efforts of the common folk, those who had endured centuries of racism, segregation, and disenfranchisement. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks became the faces of the movement, but the struggle for civil rights was not just their story. It was the story of the millions of African Americans who marched, protested, and risked their lives to demand equal treatment under the law. The civil rights movement was not born in the halls of Congress or from the speeches of famous leaders. It was born in the streets, in the churches, in the homes of ordinary people who had had enough. It was a movement of mothers, fathers, teachers, students, and workers who came together to demand an end to racial discrimination and segregation. The famous sit-ins, the freedom rides, and the marches from Selma to Montgomery were not just actions taken by a few individuals. They were the collective acts of ordinary people who decided that they could no longer live under the system of racial apartheid that had governed the South. Though these people were often met with violence, intimidation, and arrest, their courage sparked a movement that eventually led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This was a revolution not fought with weapons, but with courage, with the resolute belief in the equality of all people. The achievements of the civil rights movement were not just about the victory of one group over another. They were about the victory of justice over injustice, humanity over hate, and the common folk's determination to push society toward equality and freedom. The people who participated in the civil rights movement were not fighting for personal gain. They were fighting for a better world for their children and grandchildren. Their struggle was not just political. It was profoundly moral, grounded in the idea that every human being deserves respect and dignity. The common folk's contributions to history are not confined to the fight for racial equality or the abolition of slavery. Throughout history, they have also been at the heart of movements for labor rights, gender equality, and social justice. In the early 20th century, for example, the rise of industrialization led to the exploitation of workers on an unprecedented scale. Factory workers, miners, and farm laborers were subjected to long hours, dangerous conditions, and meager wages. Yet, these workers did not simply accept their fate. They began to organize, to strike, to demand better conditions, and to challenge the power structures that had been built to serve the interests of the wealthy elite.